There's a particular kind of magic in watching a quiet, overlooked little girl discover that she's more powerful than every adult who ever underestimated her. Matilda gave millions of kids who felt unseen at home or unheard in their own families a hero who used books instead of fists and intellect instead of cruelty to fight back. The Wormwood living room, the dingy classrooms of Cruncham Hall, Miss Honey's cottage in the woods. These places became etched into a generation's collective childhood, frozen exactly as they were in 1996. But while the world of Matilda stayed frozen in memory, the people behind it kept changing. Some of that cast are still working today, still recognizable, still beloved. Some are gone, and at least one of their real-life stories carries a weight and a courage that rivals anything Roald Dahl ever wrote. Harry Wormwood is the film's blustering, small-souled villain by neglect, the father who sees his daughter as an inconvenience rather than a gift. Danny DeVito, born November 17, 1944, was 50 years old when production began, and he wasn't just acting in this role, he was directing the entire film and narrating it, juggling 3 jobs while somehow making Harry's sleaziness feel cartoonish enough for children to laugh at rather than fear. What he brought was comic timing sharpened over decades on Taxi, and in films like Twins and Throw Mama from the Train, using his physical smallness as a tool rather than a limitation, turning Harry into something almost pitiable in his pettiness. Harry represents the ordinary, unspectacular cruelty of parents who simply never bothered to see their child clearly, a more mundane villainy than Trunchbull's, but in some ways a sadder one. DeVito's career exploded both before and after Matilda, from Romancing the Stone and LA Confidential to more than 15 seasons playing Frank Reynolds on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, a role that introduced him to an entirely new generation. Now 81, he remains one of the most recognizable character actors in American film and television. Harry Wormwood remains memorable because Danny DeVito made pettiness feel funny without ever asking the audience to forgive it. Zinnia Wormwood is Neglect's other half, the mother lost in bingo nights and bleach blonde vanity, barely registering her own daughter's existence. Rhea Perlman, born March 31, 1948, was 47 when filming began, already a television legend thanks to 11 seasons as Carla on Cheers, and she brought that same brassy, no apologies energy to a character who could have easily been one note. What she added was specificity. A particular kind of self-absorbed obliviousness, all big hair and bigger excuses, that made Zinnia feel less like a cartoon and more like someone you might actually have known growing up. Thematically, Zinnia represents a different flavor of parental failure than Harry's. Not malice, just total disengagement. A woman who simply never thought to look up from her own life. Perlman's career has spanned Cheers, the Matilda production she made alongside real-life husband DeVito, and steady character work since, including a guest turn on Poker Face as recently as 2025. She is now 78 years old and still acting. Zinnia Wormwood lingers in memory because Rhea Perlman made willful blindness feel uncomfortably believable. Miss Honey is the story's beating heart of mercy, the one adult who looks at Matilda and actually sees her. Gifted, lonely, deserving of love rather than dismissal. Embeth Davids, born August 11, 1965, was 29 years old when filming began. Fresh off her breakout dramatic turn in Schindler's List just 2 years earlier, and she brought an unexpected gravity to what could have been a simple, kind teacher role. What she added was restraint. A soft-spoken sorrow underneath Miss Honey's gentleness, the sense of a woman who had survived her own kind of Trunchbull and chosen warmth anyway instead of bitterness. Thematically, Miss Honey represents the possibility of chosen family, proof that the people who save us aren't always the ones related to us by blood. David's career flourished afterward across very different terrain, from Bicentennial Man and Bridget Jones's Diary to the amazing Spider-Man films and television work on Mad Men and Californication, before she stepped behind the camera in 2024 to direct her own feature, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. She is now 60 years old, and still actively working both in front of and behind the lens. Miss Honey endures because Embeth Davids made gentleness feel like its own form of quiet strength. Miss Trunchbull is the nightmare every child who ever feared a teacher could instantly recognize. A headmistress built like a tank, running her school on terror instead of kindness. Pam Ferris, born May 11, 1948, was 47 years old when filming began, already known to British audiences for her warmer role as Malarkin on The Darling Buds of May, which made her transformation here all the more startling. What she brought was total physical commitment, the iron-jawed glare, the hammer-throw stance, a voice that could curdle milk. Built not from camp, but from genuine menace, which is exactly why the performance still terrifies kids 30 years later. Trunchbull represents institutional cruelty at its most theatrical, the abuse of power dressed up as discipline, and Ferris never once let the audience laugh at her, without also flinching. Her career continued to thrive on the strength of that fearlessness, landing her the role of Aunt Marge in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, a long run on Call the Midwife as Sister Evangelina, and a 2007 Olivier Award nomination for her stage work. She is now 78 years old and has continued working steadily, including recent appearances on Call the Midwife in 2026. Miss Trunchbull remains terrifying because Pam Ferris made cruelty feel like a force of nature rather than a performance. The bumbling FBI agent tailing Harry Wormwood is a small role, mostly comic relief, but the man behind it carried one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire cast. Paul Reubens, born August 27, 1952, was 42 years old when filming began. Already a household name as the creator and star of Pee Wee Herman, and he brought a deadpan, slightly off-kilter physicality to the role that made even a few minutes of screen time memorable. The character himself represents little thematically, a piece of comic texture in the Wormwood's chaotic world. But Reubens' presence connects Matilda to a much larger career, built on reinventing children's entertainment through Pee-wee's Playhouse and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. What almost no one knew at the time, and what the world wouldn't learn for nearly 3 decades, was that Reubens would spend his final 6 years secretly battling cancer, continuing to work and give interviews without ever revealing his diagnosis to the public. He died on July 30, 2023, at the age of 70, from complications of acute myelogenous leukemia and metastatic lung cancer, leaving behind a statement apologizing to fans for keeping his illness private. The FBI agent is a footnote in Matilda, but Paul Reubens isn't a footnote anywhere else. He endures because he made an entire generation feel safe and delighted without ever once asking anything back, fighting his hardest battle the same way he lived his career, quietly and with his dignity completely intact. Lavender is loyalty in its purest, most unglamorous form. Matilda's first real friend, the girl willing to take a dare and keep a secret in the same breath. Kiami Davile, born in 1987, fair exact date, was just 8 years old when she stepped onto set, and what she brought to Lavender was an unforced, scrappy warmth that made the friendship between the two girls feel completely real rather than written. Thematically, Lavender represents something Matilda's family never gave her. Ordinary childhood companionship, the simple joy of having someone in your corner who isn't an adult and isn't an authority figure. After Matilda, Davile continued acting through the late 90s and 2000s in shows like Moshe and The Steve Harvey Show, while also building parallel careers in modeling, music, and screenwriting. She is now 38 years old and has recently stepped back into the spotlight, producing a documentary about her own life after the film, reflecting candidly on what it meant to grow up as Lavender in the public eye. Lavender stays with audiences because Kiami Davile made friendship itself feel like a small act of rebellion. Bruce Bogtrotter exists for exactly one unforgettable scene, but it's one of the most quietly triumphant moments in the entire film. A boy forced to eat an enormous chocolate cake as punishment, who turns humiliation into a victory the whole school cheers for. Jimmy Cars, born July 26, 1984, was 11 years old when filming began, and what he brought wasn't subtlety so much as full-bodied commitment. Spending what he later described as roughly 3 weeks shooting that single sequence, chocolate reapplied to his face and shirt every single day for continuity. Bruce represents collective defiance, the moment the whole student body finally turns against Trunchbull's cruelty together rather than individually cowering from it. Kars took small roles afterward in The Wedding Singer and an episode of ER, then walked away from acting entirely by the late 90s, eventually earning a biochemistry degree and graduating in 2017 as a doctor from the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. He is now 41 years old and works in medicine, a career about as far from Hollywood as one could choose. Bruce Bogtrotter endures because Jimmy Kars made a punishment look like a triumph, one bite at a time. Bill is the steadier, more world-weary half of the bumbling FBI duo tailing Harry Wormwood, the older partner whose deadpan exhaustion plays off Ruben's character beautifully. Tracy Walter, born November 25, 1947, was around 47 years old when filming began, already one of the most reliably recognizable character actors in Hollywood, having appeared in Repo Man, Batman, and The Silence of the Lambs. What he brought was decades of practiced economy, the ability to make a small role feel lived in rather than filler, never overplaying a joke, letting the comedy sit in his weathered, unbothered delivery. The character himself isn't thematically loaded, but Walter's presence is a quiet thread connecting Matilda to an entire era of American character acting, the kind of face audiences recognized everywhere, without always knowing the name attached to it. After Matilda, Walter continued working steadily through the 2000s and 2010s before retiring from acting around 2016, closing out a career spanning more than 170 film and television credits. He is now 78 years old and living quietly out of the spotlight. Bill barely registers as a character on his own, but Tracy Walter made an entire career out of making everyone around him look better. And that's its own kind of legacy. Michael is the family's other neglected child, though neglect looks different on him. He's spoiled rather than starved, indulged into laziness rather than ignored into invisibility. Brian Levinson, born October 27, 1982, was 12 years old when filming began. Already a working child actor with credits in Predator 2 and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and he brought a bratty, believable obliviousness to Michael that made him feel less like a villain and more like a product of his environment. Thematically, Michael represents what happens to a child raised entirely without expectations. Not actively cruel, just hollow, content to coast on his father's approval and his mother's inattention. Levinson's acting career wound down not long after Matilda, with a final credit on Seinfeld in 1997, before he stepped away from the industry entirely. He is now 43 years old and runs Levinson Group Promotions, an events and party planning company, a life about as far removed from Crunch'em Hall as it's possible to get. Michael Wormwood doesn't get a redemption arc in the film, but Brian Levinson's real story quietly found one anyway, trading a childhood spent on camera for an adulthood built entirely on his own terms. Amanda Thripp exists almost entirely for one scene, but it's the scene that made an entire generation flinch. The girl with pigtails, calmly defying Miss Trunchbull over a poem, then getting hurled across the playground for it. Jacqueline Steiger, born December 26, 1986, was 9 years old when she filmed that sequence, performing it for real in a body harness and crane rig, rather than relying on visual effects. And what she brought was genuine, unshaken courage in the face of a stunt most adult actors would think twice about. Amanda represents collateral damage, the ordinary kid caught in the crossfire of an adult's cruelty, swept up simply for being unlucky enough to answer a question correctly. Steiger didn't chase a long acting career afterward. She studied linguistics at UCLA, then moved behind the camera as a producer and writer on independent film and television projects, later becoming an educator and public speaker. She is now 39 years old and still works in entertainment, just no longer in front of the lens. Amanda Thripp is remembered for being thrown, but Jacqueline Steiger is the reason that moment still makes audiences gasp instead of laugh. Matilda Wormwood is the quiet revolution at the center of the whole story, the child who refuses to be small just because the world keeps telling her to be. Mara Wilson, born July 24, 1987, was only 8 years old when filming began in 1995, already a seasoned screen presence from Mrs. Doubtfire and Miracle on 34th Street, but nothing in her resume prepared audiences for how she carried this film. What she brought wasn't precociousness for its own sake. It was a stillness, a watchfulness, the sense of a child who has learned to survive by observing rather than reacting, which made her eventual outbursts of telekinetic fury land like thunder. Matilda represents the idea that intelligence and decency can be a child's armor, even when the adults meant to protect them fail completely. And Wilson played that armor without ever losing the character's tenderness underneath it. What audiences didn't know, watching it in theaters, was that Wilson's own mother was diagnosed with cancer during production and died just months after filming Wrapped. Meaning the girl playing the most resilient child in 90s cinema was quiet living through her own devastating loss the entire time. She stepped away from acting in her teens, returned later as a writer, memoirist, and mental health advocate, and is now 38 years old, having built a second career on the same honesty and self-possession she showed on screen as a child. Matilda endures because Mara Wilson made quiet defiance feel like the most powerful force in the room. 30 years on, it's strange to realize that the Matilda we grew up with never aged a day, while the people who built that world for us lived entire lives in the meantime. Some kept shining, building decades-long careers on the strength of what they proved here. Some fought private battles the cameras never saw, carrying real pain behind performances that gave children pure joy. And some are now gone, leaving behind work that still makes new generations of kids believe that kindness and intelligence can outlast cruelty. Whether it's Mara Wilson's quiet defiance, Pam Ferris's terrifying commitment, or Paul Rubin's courage in the face of an illness he kept private for years, this cast gave Matilda something that's lasted far longer than any box office number could measure. Which character from Matilda stuck with you the most? And did anything on this list surprise you? Let us know in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with Retro Rewind for more then and now stories from the shows and films that raised us.